Instead of diving into the wild student parties, I usually spent my weekends in the dorm room with my two close friends, Jack and Sarah. We played games, watched movies, or simply talked all night. That was my preferred way to unwind after the stressful hours at Willows University. Jack, in contrast to me, was an extrovert who loved socializing. Despite that, he always respected Sarah and me, never pushing us to join the parties he found exciting. Sarah was like me. We both felt content, enjoying peaceful moments without needing chaotic parties. However, that Friday night, things were a bit different. When Jack excitedly burst into the dorm room, phone in hand, his eyes sparkled with excitement. "Hey, you guys won't believe this," Jack shouted. "I just got invited by Lydia to a party at an old mansion in the woods. She said it's going to be amazing, totally different." I looked at him skeptically. "Lydia, who is she?" Jack flashed a bright smile. "I just met her through a dating app last week. She seems really sweet and outgoing. And the best part is, she's inviting all of us to this party." I exchanged glances with Sarah. Neither of us were the type to be easily swayed into strange social events, especially when it was an invitation from a complete stranger. Something felt off from the start. A party at an old mansion in the woods, and we didn't even know the host. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice full of skepticism. "It sounds a bit odd." Jack shook his head. "Don't worry," Lydia said. "It's going to be fun. Just a small gathering with interesting people. I think we should go. Besides, we don't have any plans this weekend anyway, right?" Sarah frowned, clearly hesitant. "I don't know. I don't want to go to a party with strangers in a house we know nothing about." "Come on, Amy, Sarah," Jack laughed, trying to persuade us. "We can at least give it a shot. If we don't like it, we can leave any time." I stayed quiet for a moment, trying to think it through. The truth was, we didn't have any special plans for tonight. And honestly, as much as I didn't want to admit it, the monotony of staying in the dorm all night didn't seem as appealing as it used to. Maybe a little change would be fun. "All right," I sighed. "But if things get weird, I'll be the first to leave." Sarah looked at me, then at Jack, and finally shrugged in agreement. "Same here." Jack jumped up, excited. "Awesome. I'll let Lydia know we're coming." I told myself that this was just a party like any other. Surely, there was nothing too special about it. But deep down, I still had a vague feeling that something was off. We decided to leave in about an hour. While getting ready, I couldn't shake the thoughts about Lydia, the girl Jack had just met online. Why would she invite us, complete strangers, to a party at such a remote location? It didn't make sense. But instead of voicing my concerns, I tried to push away those worries, convincing myself I was overthinking. Finally, we were ready. Jack called a car to take the group to the mansion. Before leaving the room, I took a deep breath. "There's nothing to worry about," I told myself. "It's just another evening like any other. We'll meet a few people, chat for a bit, and head home." Still, the strange feeling lingered the entire ride. And perhaps that was the first sign of what was about to unfold. We left the dorm as dusk began to settle in. The air outside was crisp, and the night sky seemed to be cloaked in a light mist, adding to the mysterious atmosphere. Jack looked incredibly excited, while Sarah and I felt much less comfortable. The car we had called glided along the empty, narrow roads, moving further from the city center and heading toward the outskirts, where the mansion was hidden deep within a forest. The farther we drove from the streetlights, the darker it became. Trees grew thick on either side of the narrow road, their long, twisted branches seeming to reach out, as if trying to enclose the path we were on. I sat in the back with Sarah, my hand gripping my phone unconsciously. Jack, seated in the front, was eagerly texting Lydia, updating her on our progress. But oddly enough, ever since we had gotten into the car, she hadn't replied to a single message. That silence gnawed at me, deepening the uneasy feeling in my chest. "Has she said anything yet?" I asked, unable to hide the doubt in my voice. Jack shook his head, giving a slightly forced smile. "She's probably just busy getting the party ready. Nothing to worry about." I glanced over at Sarah, and it was clear she was sensing the same unease. Still, none of us voiced our concerns. We continued on the journey, but I couldn't ignore the growing chill creeping up my spine, seeping into every cell of my body. The road became increasingly desolate, and the silence inside the car was almost suffocating, broken only by the hum of the engine in the dark night. We had been driving for about 45 minutes, and instead of feeling like we were getting closer to our destination, everything felt more unfamiliar and eerie. Outside the window, all I could see were dense, shadowy, no houses, no streetlights, no signs of life. Just an oppressive darkness closing in around us. "Jack, are you sure we're going the right way?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. Jack glanced at his phone for a moment, frowning slightly. "Yeah, according to the GPS, we're almost there. Don't worry." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. This road was too empty, too isolated. If this really were the location of a party, why were there no signs of life? No other cars, no noise from a crowd, not even lights from any nearby houses. Just as I was about to suggest we turn back, the car slowly came to a stop in front of a narrow gravel path that led deep into the forest. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, and in the distance, we could make out the faint silhouette of a large mansion nestled among thick trees. The mansion looked both grand and mysterious, almost like it didn't belong in this world. My heart began to race, and in that moment, I had the overwhelming urge to turn around and run. Something about this place felt wrong. "We're here," Jack announced, his voice full of excitement. "That's the mansion?" Sarah asked, her anxiety clearly growing. The house in front of us was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was enormous and ancient, with somber grey stone walls and towering windows, most of them covered by heavy curtains. The dim light from inside barely spilled out, more like faint, lost glimmers in the overwhelming darkness. The surrounding atmosphere was eerily quiet. There wasn't a sound except for the soft rustling of wind through the trees. "This house feels kinda strange," I whispered, trying to keep my composure. Jack laughed loudly, attempting to ease the tension in the air. "It's probably just an old mansion. Don't worry so much. We're here to have fun, remember?" Despite Jack's reassurances, the oppressive feeling of unease only grew as I stared at the mansion, its dark presence looming over us. Something didn't feel right. Sarah and I stepped out of the car, our legs trembling slightly from nerves. An oppressive feeling clung to me as we moved forward, following the stone path leading to the mansion's gate. The surrounding silence was unsettling. Not a single sound broke the stillness. I glanced up, seeing the towering walls of the mansion looming over us, almost as if they were pressing down, suffocating. As we got closer, The main door of the mansion slowly creaked open, as if someone had been waiting for us. An older man, dressed in a black suit, stood solemnly at the entrance, silently observing us. Jack stepped forward, greeting him cheerfully. "Hello, we're here for Lydia's party." The man gave a slight nod, still not saying a word, and opened the door wider, silently inviting us inside. I exchanged a glance with Saray, both of us feeling increasingly uneasy, but we followed Jack through the entrance, nonetheless. Inside, the atmosphere was just as heavy and mysterious as it had been outside. Inside the mansion was nothing like I had imagined. There was no loud music, no bustling crowd. Instead, everything was decorated with a strange sense of elegance and mystery. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a dim golden glow that illuminated the ancient paintings lining the long hallway. The silence was unsettling, as if the house itself was harboring deep, hidden secrets. As we ventured further in, I couldn't shake the questions swirling in my mind. What kind of party was this really? And why had we been invited here? Each step I took felt heavier, weighed down by the eerie atmosphere that surrounded us. Something about this place didn't feel right, and the sense of dread that had been creeping in from the moment we arrived now felt impossible to ignore. As we stepped deeper into the mansion, the unease I had felt earlier became even more pronounced. The house was overwhelmingly large, but not in a modern, luxurious way. It was steeped in mystery and strangeness. I felt like we had crossed into another world, where everything was shrouded in a mist of unfamiliarity. The antique architectural details and lavish furnishings should have made the house feel cozy, but instead, they only added to the oppressive, gloomy atmosphere. Ahead of us was a grand hall with gleaming marble floors. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a faint, yellowish light that wasn't strong enough to chase away the shadows lurking in the corners of the room. I glanced at the paintings lining the walls, portraits of stern-faced men and women, their eyes seeming to follow our every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the only living beings in this house. Something unseen was watching us, silently and mysteriously. Jack, seemingly oblivious to the odd atmosphere around us, was still filled with excitement. He walked ahead, constantly talking about Lydia and the party that was about to happen. Sarah and I followed behind, but I could clearly see the tension on her face. Neither of us spoke, but we exchanged a look that confirmed what we both felt: this place made us uncomfortable. Something was wrong, and we both knew it. The man in the black suit who had opened the door for us silently led us down a long hallway toward another room. His footsteps were light and slow, making no sound on the marble floor. I glanced at Sarah and noticed she was also looking around like me, trying to take in every detail of the house. The deeper we ventured, the stranger everything felt. Something was off here, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. When the man stopped in front of a large door, he slowly opened it. Light spilled out from the room beyond, and what lay inside was nothing like what I had imagined for a party. There was no music playing, no lively chatter or the hum of a crowd. Instead, the spacious room was adorned with a grand chandelier, luxurious furniture neatly arranged, and only a few people sat quietly, scattered throughout the space. The atmosphere felt almost eerie-silent, controlled, and far from the lively gathering I had expected. My unease deepened, and I could sense that Sarah felt it too. The party attendees were all dressed in formal attire, as if they had stepped out of a different era. The women wore long, flowing gowns and muted, aged colors, while the men donned classic black suits with neatly tied ties. There was no loud laughter, no cheerful conversations. Instead, everyone carried an air of mystery and detachment, as though they weren't truly present. They sat in silence, their eyes staring forward, occasionally turning their heads to glance at us as we entered the room. Jack seemed a bit taken aback by the atmosphere. This is different from what I expected," he mumbled to Sarah and me. "But maybe the party is just getting started." I wasn't so sure. I tried to stay calm, but there was no denying how strange everything felt. We quietly sat down on one of the chairs nearby, not saying a word, just observing the room. Sarah sat next to me, her eyes scanning the space as if searching for someone, probably Lydia. But there was no sign of the girl Jack had been eagerly awaiting. The unease continued to build within me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The room, like the rest of the mansion, exuded a tense, unsettling atmosphere. The chandelier cast a dim, flickering light, just enough to illuminate the walls lined with old portraits. I couldn't shake the feeling that those paintings were watching us, like invisible eyes following our every move. A chill ran down my spine, and the more I stared at the paintings, the stranger they seemed. Each person depicted in the portraits had a stern, almost lifeless expression. But there was something even more disturbing. Faint green marks on their necks, barely visible but undeniably there. Startled, I turned to Sarah. "Do you see something strange about those paintings?" I whispered. Sarah frowned, following my gaze to the nearest portrait. She stayed silent for a long moment, her eyes narrowing in focus. Then, she gave a small nod. I noticed it too. There's something wrong. Those green marks on their necks. Her voice trailed off, and I could feel the growing sense of dread between us. Whatever this place was, it was becoming increasingly clear that it held dark secrets, and we were caught in the middle of it. Before we could say anything more, Jack turned around, still looking excited. "I haven't seen Lydia yet, but I'm sure she'll show up soon. You know how parties are, it always takes a little while for things to get going." I didn't respond, just sat there, my mind swirling with anxiety. It wasn't just the paintings. Everything about this house felt wrong. The people attending the party, the eerie silence, the way their quiet eyes seemed to observe us, it all evoked a chilling sensation, as if we had stepped into a place where we didn't belong. I started to wonder if we should even stay. Something deep inside me urged us to leave immediately, but I didn't want to ruin Jack's night either. Maybe, I thought, I was just overreacting. If we gave it some time, maybe everything would turn out fine. But deep down, I knew this unsettling feeling wasn't going to go away so easily. Something was terribly off, and I couldn't shake the sense of impending dread. The room grew stranger the longer we stayed. Time passed, yet the atmosphere showed no signs of a typical party. There was still no music, only the faint murmur of quiet conversations. Even the people talking seemed distant and cold, as if detached from the present. I glanced around, searching for Lydia, the person Jack had been so eager to meet. But there was no sign of her anywhere. I turned to Jack. He was still trying to maintain a cheerful demeanor, but I could see the worry beginning to creep into his eyes. "Are you sure Lydia said the party was tonight?" I asked, feeling I could no longer keep my unease to myself. "Yeah, she definitely said it was tonight," Jack replied, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "She's probably just busy with something. You know, being the host and all." But I could tell Jack wasn't as sure as he was pretending to be. The uncertainty in his voice echoed my own growing fear. Something was wrong here. Lydia was nowhere to be found, and the atmosphere in this mansion only grew more unsettling with every passing minute. Suddenly, I noticed 3 women approaching us. They stood out starkly from the rest of the guests in the room. Unlike the others, who were dressed in formal, old-fashioned attire, these 3 women wore short, modern dresses and moved toward us with bright smiles. Their hair was sleek, their makeup immaculate, but what unsettled me the most was their smiles. There was something off about the look in their eyes. "Hello there," said the blonde woman, her voice soft, but with a hint of something unnatural. "You seem new. Is this your first time here?" Jack, never one to miss a chance to flirt, smiled back immediately. "Yeah, we were invited by a friend named Lydia. Do you know her?" The 3 women exchanged glances, and then the blonde smiled again, even wider. "Oh, Lydia. She might be a bit busy right now, but don't worry, we'll make sure you have a good time tonight." She raised a bottle of wine, her grin growing even brighter. "Come on, let's raise a toast to welcome you." There was something about their overly friendly demeanor that made my stomach twist. I glanced at Sarah, who looked just as uneasy as I felt. Something wasn't right, and despite their cheerful smiles, an invisible tension lingered in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but Jack seemed unfazed. He shrugged and took the glass of wine from the blonde woman's hand. Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances. Clearly, neither of us wanted to drink. However, not wanting to seem rude, I reluctantly picked up the glass, but didn't take a sip. "Thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we don't really know anyone here except Lydia. Could you tell us where she is?" The other woman, with sleek black hair, giggled softly. "Oh, don't worry about Lydia. She'll show up when the time is right. For now, just relax and enjoy yourselves." Things only got stranger as they began asking us odd questions. The blonde woman kept pressing us about our lives, as if she wanted to know every detail from what we studied, where we lived, to our likes and dislikes. It wasn't normal small talk. It felt more like she was gathering information for some unclear purpose. I got the sense that she wasn't genuinely interested in our answers, but rather in cataloging facts about us in some unsettling way. Sarah shifted uncomfortably beside me, her unease mirroring my own. I tried to keep calm, but the more they pried, the more it felt like we were being drawn into something we couldn't fully understand. I glanced at Sarah, and it was clear she was feeling just as uncomfortable. The overly personal questions and the way these women looked at us made it impossible for either of us to relax. Then, I began to notice another strange detail, the same faint green marks on their necks, just like the ones I'd seen in the portraits and on the other guests. This couldn't be a coincidence. Leaning closer to Sarah, I whispered, "Do you see those green marks on their necks?" Sarah nodded slightly, her eyes still fixed on the 3 women. "I noticed it earlier. They seem off." A shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just the clothes or the eerie atmosphere, there was something deeply strange about the people at this party, as if they didn't quite belong. The 3 women in front of us appeared friendly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that every gesture, every smile, was carefully rehearsed. They didn't seem like ordinary people. Something was wrong. And the longer we stayed, the more it felt like we were in danger. Jack was still happily chatting with the women, but I noticed he was drinking more and more. Each time he finished a glass, they quickly refilled it for him. With every new drink, their smiles grew wider. but there was something unsettling behind their eyes, something that didn't seem genuinely joyful. Maybe Jack sensed something strange too, but he didn't seem to care much. I scanned the room again, trying to spot Lydia or any sign of her, but she was still nowhere to be found. The other guests, despite their formal attire, didn't interact with each other at all. They just sat quietly, observing, as if they were waiting for something. Sarah tugged lightly at my sleeve, signaling that it was time for us to say something. I nodded, turning to Jack, but before I could speak, one of the three women cut me off. "Come on, don't worry so much. Just relax. The night is still young," the black-haired woman said, her voice sweet in a way that made my skin crawl. As soon as she finished speaking, the lights in the room dimmed slightly. A faint haze of smoke began to spread from somewhere, filling the room with a mysterious, dreamlike atmosphere. My heart started racing, and a single thought echoed in my mind: we shouldn't be here. I glanced at Sarah, her eyes wide with the same fear I was feeling. Whatever this was, it was no ordinary party. We needed to leave before it was too late. Time passed, and the strange feeling in my gut grew stronger. I began to notice a detail that made it impossible for me to stay calm. On the necks of every single guest in the room, all of them, was a faint green mark, almost like a bruise, but identical in uniform. These marks couldn't be normal. They were too consistent. From those sitting on the chairs to the servers quietly moving around, they all had the same green mark, and it sent a chill down my spine. Leaning closer to Sarah, I whispered, "Do you see it? The strange green marks on their necks?" Sarah nodded slightly, her eyes filled with worry. "I've noticed them too. Everyone has worn this. This isn't right." Jack, sitting next to us, had been trying to stay relaxed, but when he heard us mention the marks, he began paying attention. He glanced around the room, and I saw his eyes widen in shock. Though Jack didn't want to admit it, it was clear he was starting to sense the oddness of the situation as well. Maybe it's some kind of new fashion trend. I mean, it could be, right? Jack tried to offer a reasonable explanation, but his voice lacked conviction. The unsettling reality of the marks, combined with the eerie atmosphere, left us all in silent agreement. One thing was very wrong here. I couldn't agree with Jack. Those green marks didn't look like makeup, and they certainly weren't some casual fashion trend. They were too uniform, appearing on every single person in the room. It made it impossible to shake off the growing unease wrapping itself around me like a cold fog. I turned to study the guests more closely. They sat there, quietly chatting among themselves, but their smiles seemed forced, almost unnatural. There was a chill in their eyes, a cold distance, as if they were all hiding some terrible secret we weren't allowed to know. Every time we tried to catch their gaze, they quickly looked away, as though they didn't want us to see too much. Suddenly, a shiver ran down my spine. I remembered the strange, watchful eyes in the portraits we'd passed earlier when we first entered the mansion. The stern faces of the men and women in those paintings had seemed odd at the time, but now, a horrible realization hit me. Every single person in those portraits had the same faint green marks on their necks as well. The connection between the guests and those eerie portraits was too obvious to ignore. The green marks weren't just a coincidence. They were part of something far more sinister. "I don't like this place at all," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong about this whole place." "Maybe we should leave," I suggested, the growing unease in my chest nearly suffocating. Jack, though still trying to stay calm, was clearly feeling unsettled too. We can't just leave now. I need to see Lydia first. She's probably going to show up any minute. But deep down, I knew we shouldn't stay another second. This house wasn't normal. The people at this party weren't normal. And those green marks, I was certain they were a sign of something far worse that we hadn't yet realized. Sarah tugged on my arm, her eyes filled with concern. Amy, do you remember earlier when I mentioned something about Lydia? Yeah, I remember, I replied, slightly confused by her sudden question. Sarah hesitated, her face pulling slightly. Lydia. She wasn't supposed to be here. I checked her social media before we left, and there was no mention of any party. Something about this just doesn't add up. What if she didn't invite us after all? Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. If Lydia didn't invite us, then who had? And why? The dread in my stomach twisted into something far darker. It's strange that no one here has even mentioned her, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Lydia, the one supposedly hosting this party. No one seems to know who she is. And the way these people act, it's like we're outsiders, like we don't belong here. Sarah's words deepened my sense of unease. We didn't know anything about Lydia other than what Jack had told us. All we knew was that she had supposedly invited us here. But beyond that, who was she? And why was this party so bizarre? A rising panic took hold of me. We needed to leave immediately before something went terribly wrong. I turned to Jack, my voice tense. I don't think this place is safe. We should go, now, before anything bad happens. Jack looked torn, glancing between me and the room around us, as if wrestling with the situation. The weight of the strangeness seemed to finally be sinking in for him too. Maybe you're right, he said, his voice quieter now. Something doesn't feel right. But even as he said that, I could feel the eyes of the guests watching us from the shadows, their cold, distant gazes following our every move. The sense of danger was palpable. We had to leave before it was too late. Jack was still hesitating, but before he could respond, one of the guests stood up and approached us. He was a tall man, around 50 years old, with a faint yet cold smile on his face. And just like the others, there was a clear green mark on his neck. You're friends of Lydia, correct? He asked, his deep voice calm, but there was something unsettling in the way he spoke. She said she'll be here shortly, but until she arrives, why don't you enjoy a little more wine? I swallowed hard, my heart pounding faster. There was something in his eyes that I instinctively distrusted, and as he extended his hand toward us, I noticed a small green mark on his wrist, identical to the ones on everyone else. No, thank you, I replied quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. We just need a moment to rest. The man's smile never faltered, but the intensity in his gaze made it clear that he wasn't buying my excuse. The room felt colder, and the tension in the air was palpable. We were running out of time. Sarah and I exchanged a quick glance. We needed to leave, and soon. The man smiled briefly, then turned away without another word. But his presence had left a heaviness in the air, making the atmosphere in the room feel even more oppressive. Jack watched him walk away, then looked back at me. Maybe you're right. I feel it too. Something isn't right. Let's get out of here. Without another word, the three of us stood up, trying to leave the room as quietly as possible. But as we stepped into the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that dozens of eyes were following us, watching our every move from behind. It was as if the other guests knew we had realized the truth about this place. and they weren't going to let us leave so easily. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chilling fear gripped me. We had to move quickly, before it was too late. There was no turning back now. As we stepped out of the room, the air in the hallway became even more suffocating. The atmosphere was cold and heavy, as if the very walls were pressing down on us. The stone walls felt icy. The dim lights cast long, eerie shadows, and the sound of distant footsteps echoed faintly, amplifying the tension. I glanced at Jack and Sarah, both wearing the same anxious expression, as if we all sensed something was terribly wrong, but were too afraid to say it out loud. Our pace quickened as we tried to find our way back to the front door, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, winding and twisting, with no end in sight. The ancient stone walls felt like they were closing in, trapping us in a maze with no escape. I think we need to get out of here immediately, I whispered to Jack and Sarah, trying to keep my voice low. Something is seriously wrong with this place. They nodded in agreement, their faces pale with worry. The unease was palpable, and with each step, the urgency to escape grew stronger. It was as if the house itself didn't want us to leave, and the longer we stayed, the deeper we fell into its sinister grip. Jack nodded, his face now completely devoid of the earlier confidence. Yeah, I agree. Lydia hasn't shown up, and the people at that party, they're too strange. Sarah stuck close behind us, her eyes darting nervously around the hallway. Do you guys feel like someone's watching us? She asked, her voice trembling. I felt it too. It was as if invisible eyes were tracking our every move, watching us silently from the shadows. I glanced back, but the hallway behind us was empty. No sign of anyone. Still, the unnerving sensation of being followed refused to leave. We turned right at the end of the corridor, and suddenly I saw Himmerman standing by a door ahead of us. It was the older man we had seen earlier in the party room. He stood there in complete stillness, his eyes locked on us, as if he had been waiting. There was no surprise in his expression, only a cold, steady gaze. A shiver ran down my spine. It felt like we were trapped, like there was no escaping whatever this place had in store for us. What are you looking for? The man asked, his voice deep and steady. You're not trying to leave, are you? A cold shiver ran down my spine. We froze, none of us daring to respond immediately. The man's gaze was intense, as if he knew exactly what we were worried about. I think we need to go, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. We have an urgent matter to attend to. Thank you for the party, but we really must leave. He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was cold and calculating. Oh, you shouldn't be in such a rush to leave. The night has just begun. Lydia would be terribly disappointed to find out you left so early. She's been looking forward to meeting you. Sarah stepped forward, fear clear in her eyes. But we can't stay. We really need to go. The man raised an eyebrow, and instantly, his smile vanished. His expression became stern, icy. Do you know what happens to those who try to leave? He said, his tone growing darker. This isn't just an ordinary party. My heart raced, and I knew in that moment that our worst fears were coming true. We were trapped in something far more sinister than we had imagined, and leaving might not be as simple as we thought. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't suppress the rising fear gripping me. What do you mean? I asked, my voice trembling. The man looked directly into my eyes, unblinking. You weren't invited here by chance? Lydia wasn't the one who invited you. You think you came here for a party, but in reality, you've stepped into a dangerous game. Jack moved forward, his voice laced with worry. What do you mean? We just want to leave. Why is this happening? The man stepped closer, his face now colder than ever. The people you saw at the party, they aren't people. They're just shadows, trapped in an endless loop within this house. They were once living beings, but now they are nameless spirits, bound to this place. A chill ran through me as his words sank in. The green marks, the eerie silence, the strange behavior of the guests, it all made sense now. We hadn't been attending a party. We'd walked straight into a trap, and the people around us were remnants of something long dead. We were in far more danger than we had ever imagined. You can't leave, the man continued, his voice dripping with finality. Once you step into this house, you become a part of it. The green marks, I whispered, recalling the strange markings on everyone's necks at the party. What do they have to do with this? The man nodded slightly. Yes, those green marks are the sign of the curse they endure. Anyone bearing that mark has been bound to this house. They can never leave, never escape the fate that has been sealed. A cold chill spread through my body. The green marks. Would we be affected too if we stayed here too long? Would this curse latch onto us? I strongly advise you to leave now, before it's too late, he continued, his voice dark and urgent. The guests at this party are waiting for you to fall into their trap, so you too will become one of them. If you leave right now, perhaps there is still a chance to escape. His words sent a fresh wave of panic through me. The time for doubt was over. If we didn't leave now, we would be doomed to share the same cursed fate as the others. Without needing to hear more, I turned to Jack and Sarah, my heart racing with fear. We have to go. Now, I said quickly, almost desperately. We can't wait any longer. Jack nodded, his face pale and tense. I agree. Let's get out of here. We hurried down the hallway, not daring to look back. Our footsteps echoed loudly in the otherwise silent corridor. My heart pounded wildly in my chest, and my breaths came in short, anxious gasps. We sprinted toward the front door, each step bringing us closer to what we hoped was our escape. But just as we neared the door, a chilling sound stopped us, dead in our tracks of voice, accompanied by cold, mocking laughter coming from behind. Are you sure you'll make it out? I turned around and saw him standing there, his face cold, his eyes dark and menacing. But it wasn't just him behind him. The guests from the party, each with the green marks on their necks, began to emerge. They moved silently toward us, their smiles more grotesque than ever. We couldn't hesitate any longer. The three of us bolted toward the front door. It had closed at some point, but I didn't stop to think. Kai grabbed the handle and flung it open. We burst out into the night, our breaths ragged, hearts pounding as we finally escaped the twisted mansion. But as we stepped away from the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were still watching us. As if the house itself was something inside it wasn't ready to let us go. Even though we were outside, the dread lingered, and it felt like the nightmare was far from over. We raced out of the mansion like we were fleeing from a nightmare. The cold air outside bit into our skin, but it couldn't compare to the bone-chilling terror we had just escaped from inside that haunted house. Faster, I shouted, urging Jack and Sarah to run even quicker. We sprinted down the long gravel path, flanked by towering trees that loomed like shadowy figures, their branches reaching out as if to ensnare us. Sarah gripped my hand tightly, her breath ragged and panicked. "Please, let's just get out of here," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Even Jack, who had always been the tough, optimistic one, no longer hid his fear. He bolted ahead toward the car we had left at the end of the road. The car was still there, the faint glow of the headlights dimly illuminating the gravel beneath. Without saying another word, we threw ourselves into the car, slamming the door shut behind us. The silence inside the car was heavy, but we all knew we weren't safe yet. Jack sat in the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he desperately tried to start the car. "Hurry!" Sarah screamed, panic in her voice as her eyes darted toward the rear, as if expecting those strange guests from the house to appear at any moment. The engine groaned weakly, then fell silent. "No, not now," Jack muttered frantically, twisting the key again. I could feel the tension thick in the air, every second dragging by, filled with the looming sense that something terrible was about to happen. The words of the old man echoed in my mind. "The guests at the party, they're waiting for you to fall into the trap." And then, mercifully, the engine roared to life. Jack slammed his foot on the gas pedal, and the car shot forward, speeding down the gravel road, leaving the mansion behind in the rearview mirror. I let out a sigh of relief, but the sense of unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. We were out of the house, but something told me this wasn't over yet. The three of us sat in the car, none of us saying a word. We just stared out the windows, trying to calm our nerves after everything that had just happened. I glanced into the rearview mirror, the mansion now hidden in the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking, waiting for us to return. Why? Why did they want to keep us there? Jack muttered, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead, but his voice heavy with confusion and fear. "He said it was a curse," Sarah replied, her voice still trembling. "They're not human anymore. Those green marks, they're a sign that they've been trapped forever in that house." I couldn't argue with that. The eerie green marks, the unsettling silence of the party, the cold, distant stares of the guests all pointed to something far more terrifying than a simple gathering. We had escaped, but it felt like something was still following us, like a shadow that couldn't be shaken off. Though we were miles away from the mansion, the darkness outside felt heavy, and the unease in the car was palpable. I couldn't help but wonder, had we truly escaped, or was the curse already weaving itself into our fate? "We shouldn't have stayed there as long as we did," I whispered, gripping the seat tightly. "The more I think about it, the more I believe we were lucky to get out before things got worse." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "If we had stayed any longer, I'm scared. Those green marks might have appeared on our necks too." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "If we had stayed any longer, I'm scared. Those green marks might have appeared on our necks too." The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't shake the image of the guests in the mansion, their pale skin marred by those faint green marks. We had been so close to becoming part of that curse, trapped forever in that house, never able to escape. The weight of what could have happened pressed down on me. We had narrowly avoided a fate worse than death, and the eerie silence in the car only emphasized how close we had come. Though we had escaped, the shadow of that mansion still hung over us, a reminder of how easily we could have been lost. The car sped down the empty road, leaving behind the darkness of the forest and the haunted mansion. The night sky cleared up, but I still couldn't shake the sense of unease. Something wasn't right. It felt as though the horrors we had escaped from were not yet over. Suddenly, Jack's phone rang. The sound cut through the silence, making all three of us jump. Jack quickly glanced at the screen, and I saw his eyes widen in shock. "Lydia," he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Lydia's calling. A surge of tension gripped me. Lydia, the person we had never met, the one we thought wasn't real. And now, she was calling Jack right after we had fled the mansion. Jack hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. But after a moment, he finally answered the call. "Lydia," he said cautiously. There was a brief silence on the other end, and then a voice calm, almost eerily responded, "You left too soon." A heavy silence filled the car, and I could see the shift in Jack's expression as he listened. He didn't say a word, but his eyes slowly widened, shifting from surprise to fear. Finally, Jack hung up, his hands trembling, eyes fixed ahead. She said, "What did she say?" I asked, my voice tight with worry. Jack swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper, choking on the words. She said, "We can't escape. The party isn't over." My whole body froze. I turned to Sarah, who sat in stunned silence, her face pale with shock. The fragile sense of safety we had felt after leaving the mansion evaporated in an instant. Lydia wasn't who we thought she was, and if the party wasn't over, then had we really escaped the curse? The realization hit me like a wave. We might have left the house, but something darker, something more terrifying, was still tied to us. The nightmare hadn't ended, it was just beginning. Just as I was trying to process everything, Sarah's phone buzzed in her hand. She looked at the screen, her face paling even more, and then she lifted her gaze, her eyes wide with fear. "I got a message too," she said, her voice breaking with terror, "from an unknown number. It says we can never escape." The car continued speeding down the road, but a grim certainty settled over me. We were fleeing, but the party wasn't over. The ghosts of that cursed mansion, they were still watching us, following us, waiting for the moment when we would realize we couldn't outrun what had already claimed us. The air in the car grew thick with fear, and the road ahead seemed endless. We weren't safe, and deep down, we all knew it. The atmosphere inside the car grew heavier and more suffocating with each passing second. After Lydia's call and Sarah's eerie message, the car sped down the road, but it felt like every meter stretched out endlessly. Everything outside blurred, leaving behind only a sense of creeping fear and confusion. She said the party isn't over. What does that mean? I muttered, my voice trembling with uncertainty. Sarah, sitting in the back seat, her eyes red from worry, kept glancing out the window as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. "I don't know, but what do we do? We left that place. We aren't going back." Jack's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his face tense with stress. "We can't go back, but if they're right, if we really can't escape this party, then maybe leaving the house didn't really save us." The reality of his words sank in, sending a chill through the car. It wasn't just about the mansion anymore. The party was something much darker, something beyond the physical walls of the house. The cursed marks, the green stains, they could still reach us, even miles away from that place. I instinctively rubbed my neck, dreading what might come next. Jack's question left me speechless. I didn't know how to respond, because deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. Even though we had left the mansion behind, the feeling of being watched clung to us like a shadow. And those messages, the call from Lydia, they weren't coincidences. We had been driving for about 10 minutes, and the streets of the town finally came into view. It seemed like we had escaped the eerie forest and returned to the real world. But just as we neared the edge of town, something terrible happened. "Jack, stop the car!" Sarah screamed suddenly. Startled, I whipped my head forward, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Standing in the road, directly in front of the car, was a group of people, motionless under the glow of the streetlight. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there as if they had been waiting for us. The dim yellow light from the street lamp cast long, ghostly shadows, illuminating their forms in a way that made them seem otherworldly. My heart raced as the car slowed to a stop, and I realized with a sinking feeling who those figures were. The same people we had seen at the party, the ones marked by those faint green stains. They had followed us, and now they were here. Jack slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see the figures in front of us. They weren't ordinary pedestrians. Those silhouettes, they were eerily familiar. It can't be, I whispered, my eyes wide with horror. It's them. The guests from the party. Yes, standing before us were the same strange guests from the mansion party. They were still dressed in their formal attire, their faces expressionless. But the most unsettling thing of all was the green marks on their necks, now more visible than ever. They said nothing, simply staring at us, unmoving, as if they were waiting for something. Jack and Sarah sat frozen, all of us too terrified to even breathe. We had left the house, but these people, these ghosts, had followed us, appearing in front of us as if they had never intended to let us go. The silence around us was suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of the car's engine. We were trapped. Even in the outside world, the curse hadn't let us go. Those cursed guests were still with us, and it felt like the nightmare had only just begun. "We have to go," I whispered, my voice trembling as panic gripped my mind. "We can't stay here." Jack nodded, but before he could act, one of the guests, a tall man in a black suit, the same man we had encountered earlier in the mansion, stepped forward. His face was cold and emotionless. He stood directly in front of the car, raising his hand as if signaling us to stop. "Go, Jack!" I shouted, the panic inside me erupting. Jack didn't need any more convincing. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the car surged forward. In that split second, I thought we were going to hit the man, but just before the impact, he vanished. Suddenly, completely, as if he had never been there. The rest of the figures disappeared too, fading into the air like ghosts. I gasped, my heart racing as the realization hit whatever they were. They weren't bound by the rules of this world. We hadn't truly escaped them. They could appear and disappear at will, and that terrified me more than anything. All three of us screamed in terror as the car sped forward, but I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Were those ghosts even real? Or were they just illusions conjured by that cursed mansion? "I can't take this anymore," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with fear. "We need help." But from whom? I had no idea how we could explain what had happened without sounding insane. How could we tell anyone about a cursed mansion and ghostly guests without being dismissed as delusional? Jack turned onto a smaller road, pulling over to the side. The three of us sat in the car, breathing heavily, exhausted from the fear that had overwhelmed us. Silence filled the car, the adrenaline slowly fading, but the terror still lingering. I pulled out my phone, desperate for answers, and began searching for any information about the mansion we had just fled. Maybe there was something we didn't know, a secret, a story that would explain what we had experienced. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the results. hoping to find anything that could shed light on the dark mystery we had stumbled into. I searched for the name of the area and the mansion, but what came up sent a chill down my spine. The mansion in the woods on the outskirts of town, where a group of people mysteriously disappeared years ago. They were last seen attending a strange party, after which they vanished without a trace. No way. I whispered, reading the words aloud to Jack and Sarah. We were at that party, Sarah said, her eyes wide with horror. If we hadn't left, maybe we would have disappeared too. I couldn't bring myself to finish that thought either. Everything was far worse than we had imagined. That party, it wasn't just a gathering, it was a trap. And if we hadn't escaped in time, we might have joined the ranks of those who vanished, never to be seen again. What do we do now? Jack asked, his voice trembling. I had no answer. But one thing was clear. The party wasn't over, and we were caught in a terrifying spiral that we couldn't break free from. The curse of that mansion had reached us, and escaping it felt impossible. We were now a part of something far darker and more dangerous than we ever could have imagined. I couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. What had just happened wasn't a coincidence or an illusion, and if we did nothing, things would only get worse. I took a deep breath, deciding that it was time to uncover the truth about the mansion and those eerie green marks. I couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. What had just happened wasn't a coincidence or an illusion, and if we did nothing, things would only get worse. I took a deep breath, deciding that it was time to uncover the truth about the mansion and those eerie green marks. I couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. What had just happened wasn't a coincidence or an illusion, and if we did nothing, things would only get worse. I took a deep breath, deciding that it was time to uncover the truth about the mansion and those eerie green marks. We can't just sit here and wait for whatever's going to happen next, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. We need to investigate the house, find out what happened to the people who went to that party before us. Jack and Sarah both looked at me, their faces full of doubt and fear, but I could see in their eyes that they knew I was right. There was no other choice. But how are we supposed to investigate? Jack asked, his voice tinged with exhaustion. That house, it's not normal. We don't even know what's really happening. I knew Jack had a point. The mansion was far from ordinary, and everything about it defied logic. But we couldn't just sit by, hoping the nightmare would fade away. We start with what we can find, reports, old reports, anything that can tell us what we're dealing with. There has to be more about that party, more about the disappearances. Sarah nodded slowly. We can check the local archives, news articles, maybe even ask around the town. Someone must know something about that place. Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. Okay, but we stick together. I don't want any of us going off alone. With a grim sense of determination, we all agreed. The mansion had drawn us into its cursed grip, but if we were to stand any chance of escaping, we had to uncover the dark history behind it. This was no ordinary investigation. This was a fight for our lives. I found some information online, I continued, pulling out my phone to check what I had found earlier. There's an article about the disappearances years ago. The people who went to a party at the mansion vanished without a trace. No one ever found them. Sarah sighed, her face pale. So, we could end up like them. Maybe, I said quietly, but at least we know something now. If there's any way to stop it, we need to find out before it's too late. Jack bit his lip, finally nodding in agreement. So, where do we even start? We don't have many clues about the house, other than it might be part of a curse. We can start with local records, I suggested. There must be more information about that mansion, and maybe about other people who've had similar experiences. If the disappearances were reported, someone must have looked into it. And if there's a curse, it might be tied to something specific, a ritual, an event in the house's history. Sarah nodded. The local library might have archives. We could also check with the police department. If these people really went missing, they must have had family or friends who reported it. Jack rubbed his forehead, clearly feeling the weight of the situation. Okay, let's split up the tasks. We'll need all the information we can get, but we stick together and keep in contact. With a plan forming, we were ready to dive deeper into the mystery of the mansion. What we uncovered could be the key to breaking free from its sinister grip, or, if we weren't careful, it might drag us down into the same fate as the others who had disappeared. I thought for a moment, trying to piece together everything I had read. Then an idea struck me. That mansion must be a part of the town's history. Maybe we should start at the library, see if there's any story or legend about the place. Sarah immediately agreed. Yes, a mansion that old must have a long history. If it's tied to the disappearances, there has to be some record or information about it. We drove to the town's library, the only place I could think of that might hold the remaining clues about the mansion's past. The library was small, tucked away on a quiet corner street, but inside it housed a vast collection of old books and documents about the area. Sarah and I started searching through historical archives, focusing on any information about wealthy families who lived in the outskirts and old mansions. Jack, meanwhile, sat at one of the library's computers, looking up records of disappearances and strange events linked to the area. As I sifted through the dusty files and books, a sense of urgency filled me. We were racing against time, hoping to uncover whatever dark secrets this mansion held, before it could consume us the way it had those others. Not long after, I came across an old town history ledger. On one of its brittle pages, there was a mention of a wealthy family who once owned the mansion in the forest on the outskirts of town, the Whitmore family. The entry described how the house was once the site of extravagant parties. But one night, the entire Whitmore family and all their guests vanished without a trace. All that remained was the abandoned mansion and rumors of a curse haunting the place. The Whitmore family, I read aloud, catching Sarah and Jack's attention instantly. They were the owners of the mansion we were in, and they disappeared, along with all their guests, during one of their parties. No one ever found out why. Sarah's face turned pale, and Jack leaned in, his expression grave. So, this has happened before. It's the same thing. The guests disappeared, just like they're trying to trap us now. A heavy silence followed, as the weight of the revelation settled on all of us. The Whitmore mansion wasn't just cursed, was a death trap, and we had narrowly escaped becoming the latest victims. But the question remained, how could we break the cycle and avoid the same fate as those who had come before us? Sarah's eyes widened as she sat up straight. The people we saw at the party, are they the ones who disappeared? Have they died? Jack's voice trembled as he asked, "What do we do now? Is there any way to break the curse?" I flipped through more pages, desperate to find something that could help. Toward the end of the entry, I found a small but crucial detail. One man had managed to escape that party on the night of the Whitmore family's disappearance. He was the only one who hadn't vanished. But after surviving, he lived the rest of his life haunted by visions of the Whitmore family's ghosts. He eventually took his own life, leaving behind a chilling warning that the mansion would never let anyone truly escape. "There's no clear way to break the curse," I said, my voice heavy with frustration. "But one man did get out. He was the only survivor. The problem is, even though he escaped physically, he couldn't escape mentally. He ended up taking his own life because of the ghosts that haunted him." Sarah and Jack fell silent, the weight of the situation settling over us. We now knew we had escaped the mansion physically, but the curse might still have its grip on us. And if we didn't act soon, we could be doomed to suffer the same fate as the others who had fallen victim to the mansion's dark power. As we left the library, the sky had already begun to darken. The air seemed to thicken, making me feel as if something was wrong, enveloping us. The information we had just uncovered about the Whitmore family and the curse of the mansion was frightening enough. But the sense that our time was running out was even more terrifying. Sarah sat in the back of the car, still trembling after what we had read. "Do you think the curse is still affecting us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I was silent for a moment, thinking about her question. "I don't know, but if the curse is indeed haunting us, then we have to find a way to escape it before it's too late." "So what do we do now?" Jack asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as he drove. "We can't just sit and wait, hoping everything will be okay." I pondered for a moment, then an idea suddenly came to mind. We have to go back to the mansion. Everything started there, and if we want to break the curse, I think we need to face it. "Go back there," Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with horror. "Are you crazy? We were lucky to escape once, and if we go back, we might never leave again." "Go back there," Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with horror. "Are you crazy? We were lucky to escape once, and if we go back, we might never leave again." "I understand how you feel, but this might be the only way," I explained, trying to stay calm. "We need to confront what's been haunting us. If we don't, the curse will follow us forever, and none of us will ever have a normal life again." Jack thought for a moment, then nodded. "I agree with Amy. If we don't go back and face the curse, it might trap us forever." Sarah stared at the two of us, but eventually she sighed and agreed. "I don't like this idea at all, but maybe you're right. We can't let things end like this." Sarah stared at the two of us, but eventually she sighed and agreed. "I don't like this idea at all, but maybe you're right. We can't let things end like this." So, with no other option, we decided to return to the mansion. Darkness engulfed the road as we drew closer to the forest where the haunted house stood. The deeper we went into the woods, the colder it felt, as if the mansion already knew we were coming back. So, with no other option, we decided to return to the mansion. Darkness engulfed the road as we drew closer to the forest where the haunted house stood. The deeper we went into the woods, the colder it felt, as if the mansion already knew we were coming back. Finally, the house appeared before us, bathed in the faint light of the moon. Just like before, it loomed in the darkness, eerie and deadly. The lights inside were dim, but there was no sign of life. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, fear swirling inside me, but I knew there was no turning back. "Let's go in," Jack said, his voice hoarse with anxiety. He opened the car door and stepped out, followed by Sarah and me. We moved closer to the mansion, each step heavy with fear and anticipation. The front door was still open, just like last time, as if it had been waiting for our return. As we stepped inside, the atmosphere instantly became stifling and cold, as though the air inside the house had been drained long ago. The stone walls, the old furniture, and the tattered carpet underfoot wall remained just as they were last time. But this time, there was no laughter, no strange guests. The house was silent, yet that silence only heightened my fear. "What are we supposed to do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she glanced around. I thought for a moment, trying to recall what we had read about the curse. The curse originates from the Whitmore family. They were the first ones trapped in this house. If we can figure out the source of the curse, we might be able to break it. We split up to search for clues in the house. As I walked through the dark corridors and empty rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every step, every breath I took seemed to echo in the stillness, as if the spirits of the Whitmore family were still present somewhere, waiting for us. Finally, we discovered a large room on the lower floor, where a faint light from a chandelier shone down. Inside the room was a large altar, with portraits of the Whitmore family hanging on the walls. The largest portrait was of Mr. Whitmore, with cold and stern eyes. "This is it," I whispered. "This is where it all began." Jack stepped forward, staring at the altar. "What do we need to do to break the curse?" I approached the altar and saw an old book on it. Dust covered the book, but the faint lettering on the cover was still readable. "The Eternal Curse." I picked up the book and opened it, revealing yellowed pages filled with strange symbols. Among them was a passage that detailed the curse of the Whitmore family. According to the book, the curse could only be broken if the souls of the Whitmore family were freed from the house. The family had been trapped in their final dinner party, and unless someone released them, they would forever relive that nightmare. "We have to set them free," I said, my eyes glued to the book. "If we don't, they'll remain trapped here forever, and we won't be able to escape either." Jack and Sarah were silent, but I could see the determination in their eyes. We had to do this, even if it meant facing the ghosts. Just as we started reading the final passage of the book, the atmosphere around us suddenly shifted. Laughter echoed from somewhere within the house, and then faint music began to play, as if the Whitmore family's deadly party had returned. The figures of the guests at the party gradually appeared in the room, with faint blue marks visible around their necks. They laughed, they danced, but the smiles on their faces were filled with haunting sorrow and pain. "We have to end this," Jack shouted, his voice filled with fear. I looked down at the book and read aloud the final words of the ritual to free them. As the last words were spoken, the ghostly party began to disappear. One by one, the figures vanished into thin air, along with the eerie laughter and music. The Whitmore family slowly faded away, and the room returned to silence. As the last of the ghosts faded away, I felt the air in the room grow lighter. We had broken the curse. The Whitmore family was finally freed from their eternal imprisonment. I looked at Jack and Sarah, both exhausted but filled with hope. "We did it," I whispered, a wave of relief washing over me. We left the mansion, no longer feeling pursued or afraid. The night sky seemed brighter, as if the darkness that had once cloaked the house had vanished. The curse had been broken, but we knew we would never forget what had happened in that mansion. And although we had escaped, I couldn't help but wonder how many others hadn't been as fortunate as we were.